At a luxury hotel in the heart of New Orleans, a simply dressed black woman approached the front desk, composed, assured, and ready to check in. But instead of a warm welcome, she was met with snide grins, hushed mockery, and a quick call to security. Just as the situation threatened to escalate, her husband arrived, and within moments, the balance of power shifted. He ensured every staff member regretted their actions instantly. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment with where you're watching from. We love hearing your thoughts. The revolving glass doors of Hayes Heritage whispered open with a sleek whoosh as Avery Daniels entered the gleaming marble lobby, her arrival turning more heads than it should have. She adjusted her paint-splattered backpack, fatigue settling on her shoulders after 10 hours of teaching art to underprivileged black children in the lower Ninth Ward. Her oversized gray tee, marked with streaks of dried acrylic, hung loose over well-worn jeans, while a faded canvas cap sat low over her tight coils, a look that spoke of mission, not money. But purpose was not what anyone at the hotel saw. To them, she was out of place. The lobby shimmered with curated elegance, chandeliers twinkled, jazz floated from a corner trio, and marble floors gleamed beneath designer heels. The air buzzed with wealth and white glove service. Every inch of Hayes Heritage exuded grandeur, from the imported Italian columns to the crisp choreography of the staff. Amid that pristine luxury, Avery stood like a question mark no one dared voice. She paused, eyes scanning the opulence. She was bone-tired, but not confused. Her husband, Christopher Hayes, had called 40 minutes earlier, urging her not to make the long drive home after her back-to-back classes. "I'll have them set up a suite at the Heritage," he'd said casually, as if it were the simplest thing. Maybe it was for most women married to billionaires. But Avery never wore wealth like a second skin. She'd kept her last name, her job, and her roots. That was the deal, and Christopher honored it. The world around them, however, rarely did. As she crossed the lobby, she could feel the weight of not fitting in cling to her skin like the muggy New Orleans air. Heads turned. Some barely noticeable, others bold, staring from the seams of her jeans to the brown skin she wore. Guests stiffened as she passed. 2 bellhops slowed, pretending not to stare. But they saw. She'd seen that look all her life, that quiet audit. Why is she here? Only now it stung more. She was standing inside a palace her husband built. Avery reached the front desk, where 2 sharply dressed employees stood behind polished brass and marble. One was a tall, pale man with slicked-back blonde hair and a name tag that read Julian. Beside him, a woman whose red lipstick was as cold as her gaze. Julian's eyes flicked over Avery, backpack, cap, lingering just long enough. No smile. He didn't need one. "Good evening," Avery said, calm but worn. "My name is Avery Daniels. My husband, Christopher Hayes, called ahead about a room for me." Julian's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, as though questioning her claim, then narrowed with something colder. "Identification, please," he said, polite but not neutral. There was an edge there, the kind reserved for certain skin tones and certain clothes. Avery handed over her ID, without pause. Her face gave away nothing. She knew this routine. Julian studied the card for far too long before exchanging a glance with his colleague, who responded with a faint, knowing smirk. "Christopher Hayes?" Julian repeated, each syllable dipped in disbelief. His words were heavy with disbelief. "The owner?" "Yes," Avery replied evenly, her fingers resting firmly on the counter. "Christopher Hayes. We've been married for 6 years. He told me to come here directly. Is there an issue?" Julian leaned back a fraction, his face slipping into the kind of polished neutrality people wear when cloaking disrespect in professionalism. "No issue at all," he said, lips curling into a thin, performative smile. "It's just we weren't notified." And, "No issue at all," he said, lips curling into a thin, performative smile. "It's just we weren't notified. And, well, Mrs. Hayes typically makes her own arrangements. We're used to someone a bit more formal." Avery blinked slowly. There it was, not just the skepticism, not just the dismissal, but the coded message. "Not someone dressed like you." Not someone who looks like you. Don't worry, she said, the heat rising behind her eyes, though her voice remained cool. He'll be here soon. She stepped back, the sting of unspoken judgment louder than the jazz playing in the distance. Julian placed her ID back on the counter with exaggerated care, sliding it across the marble like it might leave a stain. He didn't hand it back, he distanced it. Like she was a request he couldn't lawfully ignore, but deeply wished to. Beside him, the red-lipped receptionist leaned slightly toward Julian. Her name tag read Holly, but her tone said something else entirely. "We've had a few like this lately," she murmured, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, without once looking at Avery. "People claiming to know Mr. Hayes. Happens more than you'd think." Julian let out a soft laugh, no effort made to lower his voice. "It's a 5-star hotel in the quarter," he said, a smirk in every syllable. "Everyone wants to act like they belong, especially when they don't." Then, turning back to Avery, he offered a mock-polite smile. "Mrs. Daniels, or shall I say Mrs. Hayes, I've double-checked the system. No reservation under either name. And no record of a call from Mr. Hayes. Are you absolutely sure he contacted this hotel?" Avery's jaw clenched, her voice still composed, but sharpened to a blade.
"Yes.
"He told me to come. He said he'd call ahead." Holly chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "That's adorable," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "But Mr. Hayes doesn't usually make arrangements for walk-ins." Her eyes flicked over Avery's jeans, the paint-marked shirt, the worn backpack slung over one shoulder. And then came the real blow, her voice now tight with implication. Certainly not for someone who looks like they just stepped off public transit. The insult landed hard, not just in what was said, but in how she said people who look like, and left it hanging in the air. A few guests shifted awkwardly. A young black couple near the entrance shared a glance, but said nothing. The silence thickened, loaded with meaning. "I'm not here begging," Avery replied, her voice low, controlled, and now edged with fire. "I'm here because my husband told me to be, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other guest." Julian exhaled, an audible scoff, before leaning forward, placing both palms on the counter like a challenge. "Respect," he said, voice sharp, "is something you earn, not something you wear like a costume." "Smooth as silk," Julian added. "No offense, but you're playing a role we've seen too many times. Black woman strolls in off the street, claims she's married to a billionaire. Sorry, the billionaire. It's tired. It's absurd. And frankly, it's disruptive to our actual guests." He didn't emphasize the word black, but he didn't need to. It rang through every syllable like a low, cold snarl. The message was clear. You don't belong. Not because of what you're wearing, but because of who you are. Avery could hear her heartbeat hammering in her ears, but she didn't budge. She didn't flinch. "Call him," she said evenly. "You have his number on file. Call Christopher Hayes. Right now." Julian straightened, his fake smile curdling into something rigid and brittle. "That's not how we do things. We don't just call Mr. Hayes because someone in a paint-stained t-shirt demands it." "You mean because someone black does," Avery replied, voice flat and pointed. The silence that followed was thunderous. Holly's face turned red, but Julian didn't back down. He stared at her with chilling calm. "I mean," he said slowly, "that someone like you doesn't look like Mrs. Hayes. And this hotel doesn't make a habit of indulging fantasies." Then, raising his voice just slightly as he turned to the growing line of guests behind her, he added with exaggerated patience, "There's a perfectly nice 3-star hotel just 2 blocks away. I'd be happy to call ahead for you there." That final word landed like a dagger. Avery's hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to wipe that smug expression off Julian's face, to tear down every chandelier and show them what real power looked like. But instead, she took a long, slow breath and met his eyes. "You're going to regret this," she said, not as a threat, but as a promise. As truth. Julian laughed. Actually laughed. Then turned to Holly. "Security, please." And just like that, the moment went from tense to humiliating. From a side hallway, a security guard emerged. Clint, stocky in his 50s, and moving like a man who'd already decided who the problem was. He glanced at Julian, who gave a subtle nod. "This woman is causing a disturbance," Julian said. "Please escort her off the property." Clint stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Avery didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice like stone. "Not until someone calls Christopher Hayes. Not until someone remembers that this is his hotel. My hotel. And not until someone treats me like a human being." Clint took another step, hand hovering near his belt. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Avery stared him down, not with fear, but with something colder. "It's only hard," she said, "because you don't want to believe someone like me belongs in a place like this." And suddenly, the lobby fell silent. Not with judgment, but with something deeper. Witnessing. Clint's hand hovered over his radio, his stance wide and ready, as if waiting for her to break. His face was calm, but his posture screamed assumption. He had already decided who she was. The air turned electric, charged with tension. Guests were no longer pretending not to watch.
Phones were out now.
Screens lit up as they tried to capture what they thought was just another viral moment. Another angry black woman being dragged from a place that never wanted her there. "I asked you nicely," Clint said, voice tighter now. "I'm going to have to insist." Avery stood tall, her gaze locked on his. "If you touch me, you will regret it," she said, calm and clear. "Not because I'll fight you, but because you'll be laying hands on the wife of the man who signs your paychecks." Behind the counter, Julian scoffed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Enough of this fairy tale," he snapped. "You're done wasting our time. I don't care what fantasy you're spinning. Mrs. Hayes would never show up looking like this." The word this hit like venom, spat out with such bitter disgust that even Clint visibly winced. But Julian wasn't finished. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the thrill of public shaming. "You want to know what Mrs. Hayes looks like?" he sneered. "She's white. She's refined. She wore Versace to the Hayes Foundation Gala 2 months ago and was featured in Vogue. She doesn't walk in here wearing Dollar Tree jeans and crusty sneakers pretending she's royalty." Avery froze, her body rigid. The sickness rising inside her wasn't just rage, it was heartbreak. Heat blazed in Avery's chest, not from shame, but from a fury so sharp it felt like glass under her skin. Her fingers twitched with the need to react, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Her silence was her sword. Her stillness, her defiance. And that restraint, the way she held herself with dignity while everything around her dripped with contempt, cut deeper than any outburst could. But then Holly, riding the wave of Julian's cruelty and bolstered by the silence of the onlookers, struck with a smile sharpened to a weapon. "Maybe you should go back to wherever you came from," she said sweetly. "Someplace where your kind fits in." The words cracked through the lobby like a gunshot. "Your kind." A beat of stillness. Then another. And then Avery spoke, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the unbearable pressure of history, the weight of generations pressing through her bones. "My kind," she repeated, eyes locked on Holly. "You mean black. You mean poor. You mean not what you think belongs here." "Ma'am." Clint cut in, his voice firmer now as he stepped closer. "I need you to come with me." "Don't touch me," Avery snapped, her voice rising like a storm breaking open. "Not one of you has the right to lay a hand on me while you're dripping in bias, hiding behind name tags and hollow courtesy. You think that uniform gives you power? It doesn't. It gives you responsibility. And you just failed it." No one was sipping cocktails anymore. No one was pretending this was just a misunderstanding. Murmurs spread like cracks in glass. A few people shifted awkwardly. One or two muttered, "Jesus," under their breath. Then movement. An older black man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped forward, his expression calm but cutting. He positioned himself, casually but deliberately, between Avery and Clint. "Is this how y'all treat guests now?" he said, eyes on Julian, voice smooth and dangerous. "Or is this just for the ones who don't look like you?" Julian stiffened. Sir, we're trying to handle a situation. No, the man interrupted flatly. You are the situation. Julian flushed red, the command in his voice cracking. Security, he barked again, higher this time.
Now.
Clint reached out, fingers grazing Avery's arm. And that's when it happened. The revolving doors hissed open, and Christopher Hayes walked in. Every head turned. Every whisper died. He moved with quiet precision, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. In a tailored charcoal suit that caught the lobby lights like silk, he didn't just look powerful, he was power. His eyes swept the room in a single, practiced scan, immediately clocking everything, the tension in the air, Clint's hand on his wife, Avery standing unbowed in the center of it all. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. He walked to Avery's side with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Gently, without a word, he moved Clint's arm away from her and stepped in front of her, his body a shield, his presence a verdict. And then, in a voice cool and exacting as a blade, he said, "Would someone like to explain why my wife is being manhandled in the lobby of the hotel I built?" Julian opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Clint stepped back, the authority in his face crumbling. Holly's lipstick seemed to pale. Avery said nothing. She didn't have to. Not anymore. She just stood there, seen at last. Not because of her last name, but because she had refused to vanish. Refused to be diminished. Now they would learn what it meant when grace didn't shrink but stared you down. Christopher turned, his eyes moving slowly across the frozen staff, landing on Julian like a scalpel. "Let's try this again," he said, his tone calm, but not gentle. "Who?" he asked, voice like steel. "Is responsible?" As smoke and just as suffocating. No one answered. No one could. The silence wasn't empty now. It was filled with guilt, with recognition, with the unbearable weight of complicity. A few guests looked down at their shoes. Others fidgeted, as if they could rearrange their discomfort into invisibility. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker under the weight of what had been exposed. Christopher stepped closer to the front desk, his gaze never leaving Julian, who looked like he might collapse under the scrutiny. "You don't get to hide behind policy," Christopher said, his voice razor-sharp. "You don't get to pretend this was a protocol error or an innocent mistake. This was profiling. This was prejudice. And it happened in my hotel." He paused, eyes sweeping the staff again, then the guests. "It won't happen again." Then, to Avery, his tone softening, a quiet reverence blooming beneath the storm, he said, "I'm sorry. Not for show. Not for the crowd. But for her. Because even power couldn't stop the pain of watching someone you love be diminished. You should never have had to defend your place here." Avery nodded once, her expression steady, though her eyes shimmered. The weight was still there, but it wasn't crushing her anymore. She stood taller, firmer.
Scene.
And then Christopher turned back to Julian, his next words deliberate, final. "You're done here." Julian blinked. "Sir, you don't work in this hotel another day. Pack your things." He turned to Holly. "You, too." Her breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't." "You did," Avery said, quiet but unwavering. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Christopher nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about words. It's about character. And this hotel doesn't tolerate cowardice dressed as courtesy." The guests watched, stunned. Some began to clap, hesitant at first, then more certain. A small wave of it. Not a performance. Not applause for drama, but for justice. For the reckoning they'd witnessed. And in the middle of it, Avery stood untouched by their approval. Not triumphant, but resolute. Because this moment wasn't about being vindicated in front of strangers. It was about never letting someone take her place in her own story. Christopher offered his arm, and Avery took it, not because she needed him, but because they moved forward together. They didn't walk toward the elevators. They walked through the center of the lobby, past the velvet chairs and marble counters and guests who would never forget what they saw that day. Because something had cracked open, and nothing about this place would ever look quite the same again. of you are leaving this room with your jobs." The words landed like a verdict, final and echoing. No dramatics, no raised voice, just truth, as immovable as stone. Christopher's expression didn't waver. Because this wasn't a training issue. It wasn't a moment of confusion. It was a failure of character. And I don't employ people who humiliate my wife or anyone else because of the way they look. Julian let out a small, strangled sound, something between a plea and a protest, but Christopher didn't acknowledge it. His attention had shifted back to Avery, who still stood tall, her presence the loudest voice in the room. "You should have walked away when you had the chance," she said, her words calm but laced with the same fire she'd carried from the lobby. "You should have chosen better. You should have seen me." No one responded. There was nothing left to say. Avery finally moved to sit, but not in the chair Christopher had first offered. She chose the one at the head of the table, his chair. Not because she needed the symbolism, but because it was hers, too. And when she looked at him, Christopher smiled, not proud in the way men often are when their wives behave gracefully under fire, but proud in the way a man looks at a warrior who went to battle for truth and returned unbroken. He turned back to the trio still standing awkwardly near the wall. "HR will contact you about severance," he said. "I suggest you leave through the service elevator." Julian looked like he might protest again, but Holly grabbed his sleeve and tugged. Even she knew it was over. Clint nodded once, quietly. No arguments, no denials, just the weight of consequence settling like dust. The door shut behind them with a gentle click. For a long moment, the room was quiet. Not the strained silence of earlier, but a settled one, like the calm after a storm that has cleared more than just clouds. Avery looked out the window at the skyline, glowing soft gold in the late afternoon sun. "You didn't have to fire them," she said quietly, though not with regret. Christopher crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "Yes, I did." His hand found hers. "Because you deserve to walk into any space I built without having to prove yourself to people who think they know what power looks like." She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. For the first time since she stepped into that lobby, she let herself breathe. And in that breath was the truth. They hadn't just changed a hotel today. They'd cracked open the foundation of something much bigger. And it would never be the same. For who gets offered the door? Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. Every syllable was soaked in truth, in the kind of clarity that leaves no room for deflection. "You think you know your guests," she continued, scanning the room, "but what you really know is who makes you comfortable. And comfort is not the same as safety. It's not the same as welcome. And it sure as hell isn't the same as justice." Christopher stepped beside her, folding his arms, eyes sweeping the crowd. "We say we're a legacy brand," he said. "But legacy doesn't mean tradition for tradition's sake. It means responsibility.
To grow.
To do better. To make sure the next chapter of this company is not just profitable, but principled." No one spoke. They were listening now, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper.
Guilt.
Reflection. Maybe even hope. Avery walked slowly to the whiteboard at the front of the room, uncapping a marker. She wrote 2 words in bold, unshaken strokes. "Who belongs?" Then she turned back to them. "Every decision you make from now on, from the receptionist's first greeting to the way your staff uniforms are designed, should answer that question. And if the answer isn't everyone, then you're not doing your job." The silence that followed was different now. Heavier. Hungrier. The weight of accountability mixing with a spark of potential. Christopher gave a single nod. "This is the new standard," he said. "If you're here to protect what was, you're in the wrong room. But if you're ready to build what could be, then let's begin." And just like that, the Hayes heritage redefined its legacy, not with a press release or a polished rebrand, but with a reckoning. One room, one truth, one line in the sand. The work was only just beginning. For pulled low over her curls, not to hide, but to honor who she was before anyone tried to define her. Staff greeted her with warmth, not performative, but practiced, real. Guests glanced her way, some with recognition, others with curiosity, but none with doubt. She was no longer an anomaly to be explained. She was part of the architecture now. Near the reception desk, a young concierge paused in conversation with a guest to offer Avery a smile and a nod, not just of greeting, but of respect. Noticing, the guest asked quietly, "Is that?" "Yes," the concierge replied, pride flickering in his voice. "That's Mrs. Hayes. She's the heart of this place." Avery moved toward the elevators, passing a new display on the wall. A framed plaque, recently hung, bearing the updated mission of the Hayes heritage chain. Elegance is empathy. Service is dignity. Belonging is the standard. She paused for a moment in front of it, reading it not like someone who needed reassurance, but like someone making sure the world was finally catching up. A small smile played at her lips. Then she turned, stepped into the elevator, and disappeared behind its polished doors, on her way, always, to something better. In a world too quick to forget, the Hayes heritage had remembered. And in its remembering, it had begun to heal. Furrow pulled low over her curls. Nothing about her appearance screamed importance. Yet the way people shifted around her, how they met her gaze directly, how no one gave her skin or clothes a second glance, told her everything. Change hadn't merely arrived, it had settled in. At the concierge desk, Julian welcomed a tired guest with a warmth that felt sincere. He leaned in slightly, inquired about allergies, and handed her a bottle of water before she could even ask. There was no stiffness in his actions, no forced politeness, just real, grounded care. Avery watched as he guided the woman to a seating area, then returned to his desk and caught her eye across the lobby. He nodded, not with apology or deference, but with mutual respect. Avery returned the gesture. Nearby, Holly stepped out from a side hallway with a teen girl in a hotel kitchen uniform, black, hair neatly pulled into a bun, moving with the careful tension of someone still finding their footing. Holly's smile was warm as she gently led her toward the back offices. "You're doing great, Maya," she said softly, sincerely. "You don't need to earn your place. You already have it." She glanced at Avery and added just loud enough, "Mrs. Hayes helped make that possible." Avery smiled, saying nothing. She didn't have to. The work was already speaking loud and clear. Clint stood now near the entrance, greeting guests with a posture no longer guarded, relaxed, but intentional. A young black boy with locks had just dropped a soda by the door. Rather than scold, Clint crouched down, helped clean it up, and asked about his trip. The boy lit up. His mother mouthed "thank you" as they passed. Clint met Avery's eyes and gave her a subtle, respectful nod. No shame lingered there now, only knowing. Christopher appeared beside her then, slipping his fingers into hers. He wore a linen shirt, top buttons open, sleeves rolled, easy, casual. In that way he only was when near her. "You see it?" he asked softly. "I do," she replied, her voice steady, proud, but laced with something deeper.
Not just in them.
In this place. It had softened, grown into its own meaning. He turned toward a new plaque mounted on the wall near the check-in counter. It shone beneath the lights, not in gold, but in brushed bronze, unassuming, intentional, honest. The inscription read, "At Hayes Heritage, dignity isn't a privilege of the wealthy, the polished, or the eloquent. Here, dignity is a given, offered to every human being who enters, freely and without question. We serve not image, but humanity." Beneath it, a quote Avery had chosen herself from Maya Angelou, "We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike." Across the lobby, a poised guest approached Avery, voice tentative. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Hayes?" Avery turned, surprised. "Yes. I just wanted to say, thank you. My son is part of the internship program. He told me you spoke to him like he mattered, like he was more than just another kid from the wrong side of the map. That's rare, especially in places like this." Avery's throat tightened, but she nodded. "He does matter. They all do." The woman reached out, gently touched her hand. "This hotel, it used to feel off limits. Now, it feels like a place we're allowed to belong." Beside her, Christopher smiled. "That's the goal." Outside, New Orleans pulsed with rhythm. Streetcars clanged, vendors sang out, and jazz curled through the alleyways like memory, stories being rewritten note by note. Avery and Christopher stepped into the late sun, fingers laced, as the hotel doors sighed shut behind them. No longer gatekeepers, but stewards of something sacred. As they neared the car, Avery paused. A street artist was sketching portraits at the corner. She crossed the street, crouched beside him, asked about his shading, his lines, his light. At first, he looked up suspiciously. Then he caught the spark in her eyes. No pity, no pretense, just genuine curiosity, and softened. They talked for 5 minutes, maybe 10. Christopher stood nearby, quietly watching, heart full. This was Avery. Not a billionaire's wife. Not a headline. Not an icon. Just herself, a woman who once insisted on being seen before anyone knew her name. And now, because of that, countless others would never go unseen again. "Ready?" he asked when she returned. She nodded. "I was born ready." They drove home, windows down, music low. Behind them, the hotel stood taller, not for its glass, or stars, or guests, but because it had remembered. True luxury is seeing the soul in every person bold enough to walk through the door.